Welcome to my channel. Sit back and listen to the best true crime stories. Let's go.
She was found on July 26, 1974, lying face down on a cotton blanket. An unknown girl whose appearance would later be reproduced dozens of times, but whose face no one would ever recognize. A face that may well have been captured in the cult movie Jaws. She was found by a 13-year-old girl walking her dog in the sand dunes of Rachel's Point, a suburb of Provincetown located at the end of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. As usual, a phlegmatic white and red beagle named Chuck suddenly began to behave restlessly, and when passing by a stunted pine tree, he became incredibly agitated, suddenly tearing the leash. His owner, at first resisting the dog's pull, abruptly released the collar from her hands, letting the dog run away. What carried him there? The girl only had time to think as she suddenly heard the shrill, frightened barking of her dog. The dog seemed to be trying to drown out his own fear by frantically calling for human help. He had never before seen a corpse so badly disfigured. When the police arrived at the scene of the dog's discovery, it turned out that very close to the usually crowded beach, on a neatly spread green blanket, it was the corpse of a naked woman. Her body had been so disfigured by an unknown killer that the sight was etched in the memory of the guards of the quiet resort town for the rest of their lives. Jane Doe's skull had been split open with something similar to a demolition shovel. The breach in the left side of her head was almost the size of a fist. Later, probably with the same shovel, the killer tried to cut off the victim's head. But this process was not easy, and the perpetrator, abandoning it halfway through, eventually chopped off the woman's right arm below the elbow and left hand, parts that the police have never been able to find. All these gruesome manipulations were probably performed by the sadist for the sole purpose of making it difficult to identify the murdered woman. For the same reason, he tried to extract all her teeth from the woman's jaw. But even here, his calculation was wrong. Even in a dead person to do this is very difficult. So the killer was not able to completely deprive the victim of teeth. Horrible was the discovery of traces of brutal violence against the woman, which the mutilator probably carried out with the help of some wooden stick. Thank God that he had done all this with a corpse and not with a living victim. The cause of death of the unfortunate woman was an incredible blow to the head, splitting the left side of the skull, and as forensic experts will later find out, it happened at least 2 weeks ago, and not in the place where the woman was found. Also strange was the absence of signs of struggle on the body of the deceased. This hinted that either the killer was familiar to her, and the woman was not afraid of him, or she was asleep/unconscious at the time of the attack. The method of hiding the body of the deceased was also puzzling. For some reason, having chosen an open beach as the place of dumping the corpse, the killer laid a heavy light green cotton blanket in the liquid pine wood growing on the sand, on which he laid the dead woman face down, tucking her neatly folded blue Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana under her head. It would later turn out that all of these items belonged to the murdered woman, but where her undergarments, shoes, and outer garments were never identified. And the most gruesome part of the whole picture was the final touch added by the killer. He raked pine needles to form bundles, which he then inserted into the bleeding stumps instead of the severed hands. He then bent the arms and made them look like a woman trying to get up or push herself off the ground. By the way, this detail of the murder was kept secret by the police for decades, without making it public. With its help, detectives later intended to ascertain the guilt of the suspect. It is unclear whether he did all this out of a sense of mockery and for fun, or whether he thought the body looked full and alive. From afar, looking at the corpse, it could indeed seem that this is an ordinary living woman, sheltered from indiscreet gazes, in the garb of Eve, alone sunbathing in the warm sun. And maybe she was even seen by someone passing by, but deciding not to be embarrassed, followed on. In the end, the lifeless body so lay on its creepy improvised bed at least half a month, until she was accidentally found by a dog named Chuck. The rumor of the unknown's gruesome death immediately spread throughout the neighborhood. But no matter how hard the medical examiners and the police tried, her identity could not be established. In life, it seems that the deceased was a very attractive woman with a height of 167-170 cm and weight 66 kg, with olive skin, a mop of natural bright red curls, tied with a black elastic band with gold thread in a ponytail, and athletic figure. Her dental records could not be found, although it could be said that her teeth had undergone thousands of dollars worth of expensive repairs. According to the approximate estimates of experts, only the 7 gold crowns left in the mouth of the murdered cost very expensive $5,000, $10,000, and their performance resembled the new, fashioned in those years, the work of New York dentists. There was nothing to take fingerprints from for obvious reasons. Incidentally, the killer's so frantic desire to destroy the possibility of tracing the victim's identity through fingerprints hinted that the murdered woman may have had a criminal past, or they may have provided a pointer to the identity of the perpetrator. The woman's face, too, was so badly disfigured by death and decomposition that her sketch could only be considered approximate. Even her approximate age could not be determined, and experts said it ranged from 20 to 49 years old. 2 pairs of footprints leading to the crime scene and car tire prints, found 46 meters away, gave police no leads. Eventually, sometime later, desperate to find anything about the murdered woman's past life, detectives and the local media dubbed the unfortunate woman by the name the Lady in the Dunes, by which name she went down in the history of true crime. On October 19, 1974, 3 months after the discovery of the Lady in the Dunes, her body was buried in Provincetown, and her headstone remains unnamed. Alas, in the more than 44 years since the gruesome death of the Lady in the Dunes, researchers have come no closer to unraveling the mystery of her identity or her motives for murder. To this day, this Jane Doe remains unnamed, and her killer remains unidentified. However, over the years, the story of the Lady in the Dunes has been forgotten, and some people have devoted many hours of their lives to unraveling the mystery of this terrible death. Books have been written about it, and videos have been made, and several investigators still consider the case something personal to this day. Some Provincetown detectives who encountered the story of the Lady in the Dunes, while still very young, have grown old and gray. They traveled to consult top dentists and turned to psychics. Several times they initiated the exhumation of the body of the unknown deceased. They've run DNA samples and used search radar, and even repeatedly ordered a plaster reconstruction of her face and bust. But all was in vain until Joe Hill, son of the famous sci-fi writer and king of horror Stephen King, did not decide one day to review on a wide screen an old movie about man-eating sharks. There, in the large resolution frames of the movie Jaws, he seemed to see the Lady of the Dunes in person, still alive and well. But was it really her? Lady in the Dunes was in a movie? Steven Spielberg filmed his movie Jaws in the summer of 1974 on Martha's Vineyard, an island 6 kilometers off Cape Cod. For those years, shooting such a complex, spectacular motion picture was an incredibly problematic process. Initially allotted 50 shooting days resulted in as many as 120, and several times the film was on the verge of closure. But the effort was worth it. Jaws eventually became one of the best horror films of all time, a classic of horror which was repeatedly reshot. Millions of people watched this movie, many then in the 70s only from TV screens and movie theaters. However, now for many people this movie is a distant past with today's abundance of technology and products of the film industry. no one will broadcast the old Jaws on a wide theater screen. The shark there is obviously plastic. The shooting is all pre-flood, and the scenes are far-fetched. But in June 2014, Jaws was 40 years old, and to celebrate such an impressive anniversary, they decided to show them in cinemas in America for a year. And strangely enough, people, today able to find on the internet movies of any age, gladly went to the dark hall, once again to look at the plastic shark, which in 1974 the film crew nicknamed Bruce. One such viewer in August 2015 was Joe Hill, science fiction writer and son of horror king Stephen King. A few weeks earlier, he had read Deborah Halber's The Skeleton Crew, how amateur detectives are solving America's coldest cases, which included the case of the lady in the dunes. Sitting in a comfortable movie theater chair and rewatching footage of Jaws. At one point, Hill suddenly quacked and jumped in his seat in surprise. On the big and bright screen, he saw the very same lady in the dunes, in blue flared jeans, with a mop of red hair, tucked under a blue bandana. She was in a group of extras, and according to the plot of the movie, was looking toward the ocean, where a man-eating shark was at work. It's definitely her, decided Joe, and after arriving home, immediately dived into the wilds of the internet to study all known sketches and plaster casts of the woman killed in 7040 year. After looking through them all, he found the latest reconstruction of 2010, and once again made sure that the woman once filmed in the movie Jaws, as two drops of water similar to the idea of forensic anthropologists and police about the appearance of the lady in the dunes. Of course, after a moment's respite from the emotions that had overwhelmed him, Hill began to think that he had imagined the whole thing, inspired by the book he had read, and soon he forgot about this strange incident. But a couple of months passed, and one day fate brought the fiction writer with a friend who works in the FBI. They sat having lunch in a quiet cafeteria, and shared stingy men's news, as suddenly something pulled to tell his friend about what he had seen. This gesture was not casting a rod. Just Joe wanted to argue something in the dispute and said, sometimes being under a vivid impression of the written, a man can dream God knows what. But his friend asked him about everything in detail, and then did not raise his friend to laughter, and called this theory promising and worthy of attention. After which he added, and weirder ideas sometimes help solve cold cases. Having received such modest but still support, Joe Hill decided to go further, and for starters he started watching Jaws frame by frame and in high resolution. A woman resembling the lady in the dunes appeared in the movie at 54 minutes and 2 seconds. She was only in the frame for a couple of moments, but they were enough to see the slender, trim figure of a woman in her 30s, dressed according to the fashion of those years. It was exactly as described in the unsolved Provincetown murder case. After searching for the people who filmed the 1974 movie about the giant shark attacks, Hill learned that the shooting of this particular 54-minute movie took place in June of that year. Filming on the island was stopped by the end of that month, because by that time the ocean water had become so cold that the mechanical Bruce could not withstand such a temperature. Everything was coming together, according to Hill. In June, the lady in the dunes was definitely still alive. Martha's Vineyard Island is closest to Cape Cod and Provincetown. It was from here that everything needed to live on Martha's Vineyard was shipped in by ocean. Held in the quiet resort town, the high-profile filming of the horror movie attracted the attention of the local and visiting public. Many came to look at it and wanted to participate in the masses, so that at least for a moment to shine in the movie. If the lady in the dunes was on Martha's Vineyard at the time, there was a good chance she could have been in the Jaws movie. True, in those years, many girls wore blue bandanas and flared jeans, and the woman in the movie has her hair loose, not tied back with a black rubber band with gold thread like the Lady of the Dunes had. But women rarely leave their look the same day in and day out, so you have to admit it may not mean anything. However, all these investigations of Joe Hill in the end have led to nothing and did not give the police any new hints on the identity of the murdered, but only made people think that maybe millions of them at one time looked at the screens and saw in the frames of their favorite horror movie a woman whose death mystery has been trying to solve for more than 40 years. And it can also say that modern technology is one of the most important tools with which to find answers to many previously posed questions. They are still trying to recreate her face. However, the police and independent researchers all these years also did not wait for the weather and tried to recreate as close to the real image of the Lady in the Dunes. After all, if it really turns out to be successful, even after so many years may find someone who will recognize the unknown woman, finding in her missing dear person, for the first time seriously to the process of restoring the appearance of the Lady in the Dunes. Experts tried to approach in 1979. Using detailed photographs of her skull, they created her first serious facial reconstruction out of clay. In the next few decades, such reconstructions, both in the form of volumetric models and drawings, appeared a lot. And what is curious is that each of them looked little like the others. Most recently, in May 2010, after exhuming the remains, scientists subjected the unknown woman's skull to a CT scan. After that, David Hunt, a forensic anthropologist from the Smithsonian, recreated a three-dimensional image of the Lady in the Dunes using computer programs. To date, it is probably the most authentic and closest to reality. Unfortunately, however, these efforts have not helped police identify Jane Doe. Thousands of dentists were surveyed since the police were unable to fingerprint the dead woman at the time of the discovery of the Lady in the Dunes corpse. Forensics had to rely solely on her dental records for identification. Although the unknown killer attempted to deprive detectives of this opportunity as well, there were enough teeth left in her mouth to show signs of expensive dental work. The 7 gold crowns found indicated that this work alone had once cost the Lady in the Dunes at least $5,000. And nowadays, that's a lot of money, and in 1974, even more so. Not everyone could afford it, and this fact spoke rather in favor of the fact that the murdered was not a vagrant, and was a representative of at least the middle social stratum. Although I did not exclude the possibility that the Lady in the Dunes, being an attractive woman, was on the payroll of a rich man, another of the visions of what the Lady in the Dunes might have looked like. In an attempt to capitalize on this information, the Provincetown police began interviewing dentists all over America, hoping to find one who remembered a client who resembled the Lady in the Dunes. The process took months and years, but it never brought the police any closer to solving the mystery. Version 1. The Lady in the Dunes is an escaped convict. One theory long considered by police to be serious in the Lady in the Dunes case is that the Jane Doe found in Provincetown was 24-year-old Rory Jean Kessinger, an inmate who escaped from Plymouth County House Correctional Facility, Plymouth Correctional Facility, located in Plymouth, Massachusetts in May 1973. This girl, who left home at age 15, was heavily addicted to drugs and dealing them. In between, she was dealing guns and committing armed raids on banks and stores with her thug gang buddies. Kessinger had a magnetic appearance, deep blue eyes, and an ingratiating voice. Many fell under her magnetic charm, which almost played a cruel trick on the police officers who detained her. The first time law enforcement officers stumbled upon Kessinger by accident. It happened in January 1973, when Lt. Willard Balter brought a traffic ticket notice to the home of an offender. The landlord, one of the members of the gang with which Rory traded, not immediately realizing what was going on, opened the door to the police officer. But when he and his buddies realized they had let a cop in, they scattered, intending to escape. Kessinger was less fortunate than her friends. Running out into the yard of the house, dressed only in her underwear and bra, without shoes, she tripped and fell. Balter, not thinking long, grabbed her and tried to find out what was wrong. But seeing a pretty face and looking into the blue like the sky, eyes of Rory swam, starting to believe in her stories that she was a victim, which a gang of thugs raped for several days. Having pacified with tears and talking Balter, the criminal weakened the attention of the police officer, and suddenly, with a sudden jerk of a predatory animal, tried to disarm him. Willard miraculously managed to wrestle back his gun. Realizing that he was not a victim at all, the policeman ordered Rory to go into the house to get dressed, but the sly beast knocked out the general lights and slipped into one of the rooms where the gun was located. When the cop turned on the flashlight, he saw the muzzle of a sawed-off shotgun aimed directly at his chest. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to kill you," Rory said in the same oily voice, but she didn't get a shot off in time. Grouping up and ducking under her, the cop knocked the girl to the ground, took the shotgun away, and snapped handcuffs on her thin wrists. The last words Balter heard from the pretty girl were, "You wouldn't think a pretty girl like that could kill cops." To make sure that Kessinger was unharmed and not actually raped, she was initially taken to a hospital rather than to the police station. There, screaming "Die, pigs!" she made another attempt to take the gun from another policeman. However, this attempt was also unsuccessful. After this incident, she was handcuffed, and from now on, she was not relaxed for a second. So Rory Jean Kessinger, charged with drug trafficking, armed bank robbery, 2 assaults, and attempted murder of police officers, ended up in Plymouth Correctional Institution. However, she did not stay there long, just a few months. Then, on the night of May 26, 1973, she escaped from prison with the help of a hacksaw that someone handed her. After tying sheets from the laundry room into a long rope, she climbed down them from the window and disappeared in an unknown direction. Rory Jean Kessinger was never seen by the police again. She was searched in vain all over America, knowing that the girl could use one of 3 aliases: Jennifer Marie Lynn, Linda Lynn Koch, or Penny Susan Johnson. And when, more than a year later, in June 1974, Massachusetts police found the body of the lady in the dunes near Provincetown, so outwardly and constitutionally similar to Kessinger, many thought the escaped convict had ended her days among the sandy ocean dunes. For several years, unable to prove it materially, detectives believed that the Jane Doe they found was Rory Jean Kessinger, a beautiful criminal who could not escape the terrible fate of being brutally murdered by someone. Investigators were under this illusion until March 2000. In this year, the investigation decided to exhume the body of the lady in the dunes to conduct a comparison of DNA samples of her bone marrow with the DNA of her mother, Rory Kessinger. Alas, the analysis showed no similarity, and the police's main theory collapsed overnight. Version 2, the lady in the dunes is the victim of a Boston gangster. This strange version in the minds of researchers was born only for one reason: the man, who will be discussed further, had a very revealing tendency to pull out the teeth of people killed by him. Such victims of the gangster had a minimum of 11, which is proved by the court, and the maximum 19, which is assumed. The man's name is James Joseph Whitey Bulger. James Joseph Whitey Bulger was at one time an American gangster who was the leader of the Winter Hill criminal group, operating in Boston in the 70s-80s. His nickname Whitey, which literally can be translated as Whitehead, this criminal earned because of the light red color of his hair. He hated this nickname with a fierce hatred, and therefore in a certain period of life even shaved his head bald. However, he was called that only behind his back. In the open, no one dared to refer to this scumbag pejoratively because he was famous for a completely insane character. There were rumors among the gangs that Bulger always preferred to kill his opponents and enemies himself, seemingly experiencing physical pleasure from this process. He was credited with an incredible number of murders, feared and preferred not to get involved. Meanwhile, Bulger was an FBI informant for several years, from 1975 to 1993. When he was arrested in June 2011, it was revealed that he had committed most of his murders as an informant. At that point, the question was loudly asked in court: how could the FBI not have known that Bulger was a real scumbag and sadist? It wasn't proven, of course, but it's likely that the feds were aware of their underlings' abnormal proclivities. However, he was supplying them with such valuable information about organized crime, and Bulger's victims were generally no angels either, that, for these reasons, they let him get away with his atrocities for a while. But it couldn't go on forever. Eventually, Bulger probably broke all his agreements with the FBI, and on December 23, 1994, they indicted him for multiple acts of racketeering and murder. Whitey didn't wait for trial and fled. For 16 years, he was on the federal wanted list with a $2 million reward for his capture, and placed second only to Osama bin Laden as the second most wanted U.S. criminal. On June 22, 2011, he was caught on a tip from a woman who rented an apartment in Iceland with his girlfriend. The landlady received $2 million for this information, and Bulger was convicted on August 12, 2013 on 48 charges, including racketeering, drug and weapons trafficking, extortion, self-harm, and 11 murders. As a result of all his crimes, he was sentenced to 2 life sentences. He is now a decrepit old man and is living out his last days in a maximum security prison. By the way, a couple of interesting details about Bulger. James had a brother, William Bulger. He sat in the Senate for several years, and although the brothers had barely spoken to each other for several years, Senator William knew exactly what his little brother was up to. When it all came out, Senator Bulger had to say goodbye to his lucrative seat, and Whitey also became the prototype of the head of the Irish OCG in the movie Black Mass. His role was played by Johnny Depp, and the role of William Bulger Benedict Cumberbatch. But what does this have to do with the lady in the dunes, you ask? First, some of Bulger's acquaintances and associates testified that in the summer of 1974, they saw with him a woman similar in description to the unfortunate woman found near Provincetown. And second, as I wrote at the beginning, James John Whitey Bulger had the bizarre notion that the police were able to identify the bodies of murdered people solely from dental records. Bulger, like many psychopaths and sociopaths, had unhealthy sexual predilections. Some spoke of his gay orientation, others of his predilection for pedophilia, but almost everyone leaned toward the idea of sexual sadism. It is known that in the hands of this monster was a lot of women, and some of them said goodbye to their lives, strangled by his own hand after lovemaking. All of them Bulger, guided by the idea of preventing the identification of the corpse deprived of teeth. In general, this became his almost calling card, which, as a result, no longer masked Whitey's murders, but, on the contrary, revealed them. Well, the main authorship of the version linking Bulger to the lady in the dunes belongs to Sandra Lee, an American novelist who wrote a story based on his biography. In her book, Lee described the lady in the dunes as a young, beautiful woman who came to America from Ireland. Once caught Bulger's eye, she became desirable to him, but refused the gangster. Enraged by the recalcitrance of the red-haired beauty, in a fit of rage, he brutally killed the girl. after which he first stored her body for months in a refrigerator, and then disfigured it and had it dumped somewhere on the ocean. So, although the version of the involvement of Boston gangster to the murder of the lady in the dunes, and is very picturesque, unfortunately, at its core, it is mostly speculation. It should not be ruled out, of course, the killer's M.O. of pulling posthumous teeth from his victims is characteristic. But, alas, this theory has no physical evidence. Version 3, the maniac recognized Lady in the Dunes as his victim, and of course such a case could not do without a maniac. However, it was not the police who suspected him, but he himself took such responsibility. It was the American serial killer Haddon Clark, sentenced in 1993 to 70 years in prison for the murder of 6-year-old Michelle Dorr and 23-year-old Laura Hutling. While serving his sentence at the Eastern Maryland Correctional Institution, beginning in late 1999, this man, officially diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, began actively confessing to numerous crimes, claiming that he began committing them as a teenager. For example, he revealed that he had killed another child, a girl named Sarah, in 1985. His descriptions clearly matched the case of missing 9-year-old Sarah Point in a Boston suburb. However, no matter how hard detectives tried, they were never able to get Clark to tell them where he hid the girl's corpse. Other confessions of the maniac looked less convincing, and some of them are lies and fabrications. But about some of them, Clark clearly knows something that only a criminal could know. Plus, he's been found in possession of some of the victims' trophies, jewelry from missing women. So the police have reason to believe he's responsible for dozens of murders. Distinguishing truth from lies in serial killer cases can be very difficult. And here is a crazy man, at times completely out of touch with reality, trying to harm himself and others, hearing voices and constantly talking to them. Clark liked to dress up as a woman and believed that there were two personalities living inside him, the kind and harmless Haddon and the evil girl Kristen, who does terrible things. In addition, Clark is a fanatical believer. One morning, when he woke up in his cell, he addressed his cellmate with the words, "Now I know who you are. You're Jesus." In other words, this guy's brains are all messed up. By the way, just like his older brother Bradfield Clark, who in 1984 killed and dismembered a female colleague at work, and then ate her in pieces and cooked her on a barbecue, for which he received a life sentence and soon died in prison. Haddon Clark took responsibility for the murder of the lady in the dunes in 2004, writing a letter of confession to the prosecutor. In it, he claimed that in the summer of 1974, he was visiting his grandfather, Silas Clark, in the town of Wellfleet on Cape Cod. During his stay there, Clark allegedly killed 2 young women, one of whom he described as being very similar to the Lady of the Dunes. The latter he allegedly dumped on the coast, and buried the other, along with the lady's belongings, on his grandfather's property. Of course, to this statement of crazy Clark, detectives were very skeptical. However, in some cases, his words were true, which led to the discovery of bodies and evidence in the murders for which he was convicted. So the detectives decided to double-check the maniac's confession and set off with search dogs to Wellfleet. At the beginning of April 2000, the small town of Wellfleet suddenly became lively thanks to the many voices of police and journalists who came here. The detectives brought with them 3 bloodhounds, which immediately made the neighborhood abuzz with excited barking, and Clark, dressed in a woman's dress and a woman's wig. As Haddon claimed to remember everything, he had to make Kristen wake up, because she was the one who had committed all the murders. Alas, the police were unable to find anything at the spot where Haddon Clark had indicated. Later, bringing him to the location of the body of the lady in the dunes, the killer was also unable to identify the surroundings or remember anything. First, in all the time that had passed since 1974, the wind and sand had completely changed the look of the dunes and the terrain. And secondly, this crazy man often admitted himself that he committed his murders while in some kind of a fog. Sometimes he poorly remembered the sequence of his actions, confused directions and places, was lost in the dates. His memory only accurately reproduced the names of people and their appearance, but the places where he hid the bodies forgot. As the maniac himself explained, I needed the trophies, so I always remembered where I hid them, and I didn't need to keep in my memory the places where the bodies were hidden. Detectives and psychologists working with Clark noted that he seemed to really want to help the police, but in many cases could not do so because of a disease of the mind. Regardless of the shakiness of this killer's memories, however, there is one detail that makes him a very likely suspect in the lady in the dunes case. Remember that very moment with the police covering up the nuance of the murdered woman's hands, which were arranged as if the woman wanted to get up, push up? Surprisingly, Clark mentioned it to one of the detectives, Tobias Tarney. According to Tarney, one day Clark started talking about how a corpse should be properly hidden so that it would never be identified. The killer stated that in this case, the victim should be stripped of his hands, and then added, "That's exactly what I did to a girl on Cape Cod." In 1974, I was vacationing on Cape Cod at my grandfather's house, went to Provincetown one day, and I met a beautiful red-headed girl there. I lured her into the dunes, hit her over the head with a surfboard, and after she passed out, killed her, stripped her, and stacked her stuff neatly under her head, then went back to his truck, got some kind of tool, cut off her arms, and stuck the stumps in the sand as if she were doing push-ups. By the way, I later used a couple of her fingers as fishing bait. God knows why I wanted to do all that. I didn't want to hide her body for everyone to see. That statement? Of course, we can assume that this is all the result of Haddon Clark's sick imagination. That is how his confession in the Lady in the Dunes case is now officially viewed by the police. But, quite possibly, it is the detail about the hands of the murdered Jane Doe that may, albeit indirectly, indicate that Haddon was her killer, and we can certainly say that he has dozens of other victims to his credit. Some of them, according to detectives, he hid in cemeteries, burying them in old graves. They'd be virtually impossible to find, and although Haddon Clark is still alive and in a maximum security mental institution, by today he has completely lost his mind. Alas, it will be impossible to get anything more out of him. Unsubstantiated allegations, these statements cannot be called versions because they are not confirmed by anything. However, they are worth mentioning. In 1987, a woman told her friend that in 1974, when she was 20 years old, she lived in Provincetown. And that year she witnessed her father strangling a young red-haired woman to death, after which he put her body in the trunk of a car and drove her somewhere. After hearing such a terrible confession from her friend, the woman went to the police. But since this conversation took place between Canadian citizens, all that the local Royal Mounted Police could do in this case was to report the information to the chief of the American police in Massachusetts. U.S. detectives tried to arrive in Canada as quickly as possible, but by the time they arrived, the woman who claimed to have witnessed the murder in 1974 had moved to some other city without leaving her coordinates. Investigators made attempts to locate the woman, but their search was unsuccessful. That same year, 1987, Provincetown detectives were approached by another woman who believed the Lady in the Dunes might be her sister who had gone missing in 1974. According to the woman, she lost contact with her younger sister after the latter moved to Boston. The missing girl was an athlete, had olive skin, brown eyes, and red hair that is, as if, for all intents and purposes, resembled the lady in the dunes. However, the policeman who heard the story had already worked out so many versions of the case that he believed few of them. In order not to multiply unpromising theories, he simply asked the citizen who approached him to bring the dental records of her missing sister. Alas, the woman never came back to him. Either she had no information, or all her story turned out to be a fiction. As a result, to date, the identity of the lady in the dunes remains unknown, and the mystery of her death attracts to itself, like a magnet, a lot of countless theories. It is unknown whether we will ever be able to solve the mystery of her life and death. For now, the body of the unfortunate girl rests beneath an unmarked tombstone. Alas, the killer managed not only to take her life, but also to take her name away from her. After the case was solved in 2022, the victim was identified, and in the summer of 2023, the police officially named her killer. It is highly likely that Guy Rockwell Moldavan antiques dealer, who the police officially call the murderer of Ruth Mary Terry Lady in the Dunes, was not only her husband, but also a real maniac. He is believed to be responsible for at least 4 more murders. Ruth was his 4th wife, and he killed her a few months after their wedding when they went on their honeymoon to travel the States. From that trip, Moldavan returned alone in Ruth's car, told her relatives that they had had a fight and Ruth had gone to who knows where. Also probably Moldavan, he is known to have used 3 names: Raoul Guy Moldavan, Raoul Guy Rockwell, and Guy Moldavan Rockwell. I have not yet been able to figure out what these sets of names were, and how he used them officially or not. Murdered his 2nd wife Mans, Anita Eileen Ryan, and her daughter Dolores Ann Mears. She was 18 at the time of her death. On April 1, 1960, they both disappeared, and the FBI then suspected Moldavan of a double murder. They found body parts in the septic tank of his home, but at the time, technology did not allow for identification. Law enforcement officials charged Moldavan, but the judge didn't want to convict him without identifying the bodies. The killer was eventually released. Moldavan is also the prime suspect in the murders of 28-year-old truck driver Henry Lawrence Baird and his 17-year-old girl, friend Barbara Jo Kelly. Baird's body, for some reason completely naked, wearing only shoes and socks, was discovered in bushes on a sandy strip of beach on June 18, 1950. He had been shot in the back of the head, and Barbara, who was last seen with Baird, disappeared without a trace. Only the girl's clothes were found next to the body of the murdered boy. There is a suspicion that all the murders Moldavan committed on a perverted sexual basis. Sadly, he died of natural causes in 2002 without ever being punished for his crimes. It's good that this case was solved, albeit after all these years. The bad thing is that this degenerate, not worthy to be called a human being, lived for 79 years and died without answering for anything. Not all good people are honored to live such a long life, and this abomination trampled the earth, spoiled the air, and deprived normal people of life for 8 decades.